Hello, arts fundraisers, and welcome back to RSC Fundraising Growth Now. In today's video, we're going to be talking about some of the top fundraising success fundamentals. You know, in a previous video, we touched on a few of these, but we're going to get in a little bit more in depth this time. We're going to talk about 8 of my favorites. It certainly doesn't encompass all of them, but it'll start to build your library and your repertoire of what fundamentals we think you should pay attention to. You can certainly compare what you're doing now with what our fundamentals are, kind of measure up and see just how many do you have activated, how well are you doing. With the ticket sales and admissions still making a slower comeback than what anybody would like, arts and cultural organizations really now are relying more and more on recurring contributions to help support their community-based missions, to balance their budgets, and really to drive the organization forward. So growing that annual fund has become a must-have, like really growing it year over year. And so it is considered the cornerstone of any successful fundraising program. So the name itself, annual fund, can be a little bit deceiving. You probably think you know what it is, and I think I know what it is, but those two things may not mean the same thing. But in essence, when we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But really, when we think about annual fund, the first thing that comes to mind when you look at the words annual fund is that we have all year to raise this money. And while technically that's true, you do have all year to raise that money, what we like to say at my firm is that not all the days are equal. The first days are much more important than the latter days. At least they should be if you construct your annual fund correctly. So annual funds, they need more than time. So looking at it in 365-day increments is not enough because they need more than time. They need momentum to be successful. And so when I say that the days aren't equal in an annual fund, that's what I mean. You need to build momentum quickly in your results and ramp up activity and ramp up those results as fast as you can, practically as you can with the resources that you have, because there's a lot of work to be done in the latter half of a fiscal year in terms of raising new money. We need as much time as we can to raise new money. So we're going to talk a little bit about goals, and we're going to talk a little bit about momentum as we get deeper into this video. Okay, let's get started. Let's make some assumptions about your arts organization. First, let's assume that it is not in financial crisis. Fundraising through a financial crisis requires a different set of fundamentals, different set of rules, different set of skills, which I have over the years uncomfortably termed as mercenary fundraising. It is not related to what we're talking about today. We're talking about building a reliable, renewable base of support that helps your operating budget. Your organization is not in dire straits and ready to collapse. If you're in that place, call me and we'll talk about that. Second, though, let's assume that your organization already has an annual fundraising program. You're already doing recurring giving, that you have some established base of supporters. So you're not starting from scratch. You're not a brand new organization that's now trying to build a database of consumers and donors, that you've already got some track record in fundraising. Third, your organization either has the resources or is willing to activate resources necessary to fundraise at high levels. So resources in my book, doesn't just mean money. It also means the people, time, dedication necessary to up our game in fundraising. And finally, last assumption is that your organization needs to improve its fundraising results and is therefore open to making some changes to your program and the approach on how you do fundraising. So even if you have all 4 of those, terrific, we'll apply those fundamentals. But if you don't have all 4 of those, the one that you really need to be committed to is the last one. If they don't all apply, the final one, acknowledging your organization wants to improve its fundraising results and is therefore open to changes to improve those results, that's great. It is an absolute must if you want to move forward. So you can't keep doing the same things over and over again, or you can't limit yourself on message and people and resources and expect to get better results year over year. So more success in your annual fund begets more attention year over year as well if you want to continue to see those results increase for you. So as we look at some of those top annual fund campaign fundamentals, let's first define what is an annual fund, because again, what you call it and how you define it and what I call it and how I define it might be two similar but different enough things that we should define it. Here's how RSC defines it. We say, for instance, that an annual fund is made up of contributed revenue that is most likely repeatable year over year and has an impact on your overall operating budget. So what that means is you have a pretty good chance of renewing gifts, and at the same time that those gifts are going for things in your operational budget and not special events or one-time expenses or restricted money or things that are outside the norm. So this is one of the ways that we look at it is we want our annual fund to be renewable, reliable, and predictable. And so the more that an organization tinkers with that and throws in special money or project money or restricted funds, the less predictable that fundraising effort becomes. And that's a real danger. It brings some real risk to you as an institution. So that's why we have this particular definition, and that's the definition I'll stick to as best as I can during our conversation here. Secondly, as part of our definition, we look at board and individual giving being the most important part of an annual fund. So yes, contributions from companies are important, from foundations and other institutions, from government grants, those are all important, but the majority really should come from your board and from individual gifts. And in fact, we aim on our annual funds to look at about 60 to 70%, if not more, of the overall annual fund goal comes from people. So not institutions, but people. That can be your board, that can be your individual, high-level individual donors, and it can certainly be, and should be, your broad base of individual support as well. So think about that. The board and individual giving should comprise the majority of your annual fund. And let's say it's 70%. Just set your marker there if you can. If you're not there yet, it gives you something aspirational to go to. And of that overall goal from the individual giving, at least 30% should come from your board. Now, I know there are exceptions. If you have a very small board, so if you have just an executive committee sized board, you might argue with me on that. But we're talking about rules today, just best practices, not the exceptions to those. So now that we understand what an annual fund really is, let's get into some more of these fundamentals. Here's our starting point. Our starting point is to create goals, plans, and timelines that work together. So the very first fundamental is create a 3-year plan and timeline to support your aspirational revenue goals for the annual fund. So again, create a 3-year plan and timeline to make sure that it matches. So when you look at this slide and you see that we make sure that goals interact with the action plan for fundraising and the timeline for fundraising. Those have to work very closely together. And the mistake that several nonprofit organizations make, Arts being no exception, is that they will create their goals in a vacuum. The goals come first because that's when budgeting time is. And then months later, we do the plan and the timeline and we back our activity into those goals. What I usually suggest, what my firm usually suggests is you look at it more holistically. You do your goal planning, your timeline planning, and your action plan planning all together simultaneously at the same time so that whatever numbers you submit in terms of the operating budget for the upcoming fiscal year, you have things to back it. You've got facts to back it. You've got a timeline to back it. You've got action steps to back it from the start. So it's a nice self-discipline for some organizations. I'm sure it's not yours, but for some organizations who will sometimes back into annual fund goals by seeing where all the other money is going to come from and then saying, well, we've got a 14% hole here. Let's just make the annual fund goal bigger. That's no way to budget, and that's certainly no way to set annual fund goals because, obviously, if you don't have the timeline and the plan connected directly to those, the chances that you're going to be successful are really, really highly diminished. We don't want to have highly diminished goals. We want them to be aspirational, and we want to be able to reach them. So that's the approach. Goal, plan, and timeline all working together, all planned and being combined together at the same time. So during budgeting period, I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to also create your timeline and your plan. That's a tall order during budgeting period, but it will help you have higher levels of success as you go into the next fiscal year. All right, in terms of goal setting, I'm going to have you look at this slide now. It's really just an example, but how do we build an annual fund and how we actually look at those goals year over year? So our second best practice is build an annual fund with specific revenue goals by division. I'm going to show you the divisions that we commonly use right here on this slide, where you can see the headers of gross revenue, number of donors, and gift average. That's generally the way that we look at those, and I'll come back and say why just a little bit later. But the thing to pay the most attention to right now on this is the segments that we use. You can get more complicated. You can get less complicated. Maybe this is pretty bare bones in terms of segmentation, but we've worked with organizations that might have 8 or 10 or 12 segmentations. But we always want to break out the board because the board's going to have a specific goal. Then we have our high-level individuals. I think for this example, I use $1,500 plus. Depending on your budget size, that may or may not be the right zone. And then we have individual gifts below $1,500. And then, of course, we have the corporate, we have the foundations, and then you can put other institutional gifts. You can have the government grants there. And frankly, sometimes when we work with organizations, they'll just put a line that says other recurring, so that if it doesn't fall neatly into one of these segments, they can put it right there. Some organizations put in events because those events are recurring year over year. But my point is, make sure that you set these out, get your categories in a way that it makes sense for you and for your budget. Because you're going to want to track these year after year after year now so that you can get better at goal setting, better at budgeting on this revenue that is growing in importance year after year after year. So looking at how I've got this broken out, first box is gross revenue, and you can see where we are with the current fiscal year, where we actually think it's going to end, the projected year end for the current fiscal year. Then we move over into next year, and we look over into the year after that, and we look over into the year after that. So we really recommend 3 and not more than 3 years of goal setting to start to set the stage for budgeting. And so we look at it in terms of gross revenue. Then the next box down, same categories, looks at it in terms, though, of number of donors. So where we think we're going to end this year in terms of number of donors, and we use that as our starting point for future year growth, number of donors. So you might see, for instance, the board may not grow a whole lot in terms of number of donors. Maybe it will, depending on what your strategic plan looks like. But then on individual giving, corporate giving, foundations, and so forth, you can see what those numbers look like. Then we look at the gift average in that final box, which is often overlooked, of reviewing what the gift average changes. So what in our blue sky, green light world, what we hope is that we're going to see money go up, number of donors go up, and gift average go up in every category. That's really not the case. It's not. That would be very abnormal. It's not unheard of, but it's pretty rare. What we would recommend then is looking at it's completely feasible that your board may not increase in number, but it would increase in dollar amount per capita, which is going to drive up then the gift average, which is a good thing. Then I suppose unless you're a board member, you might question that. But then at the next gift level, the major gift in annual fund level, same sort of thing. You may not be able to gain lots and lots of donors year over year, but you can increase the per capita gift average at higher levels. So you could raise more money, increase the donors a little bit, but then up that gift average. Whereas on the broad base, the gifts under $1,500 in this example, you might look at that one and say, well, we can add a lot of donors, but their per capita value won't be as high. So we don't really rely on the broad base to bring in lots more money. What we rely on that is to source new donors who we can get them, we can keep them, year over year, and then we can start to increase them, move them up through that infamous donor pipeline that we all hear about, talk about, and wish for. And so that's why we look at all three of these: gross revenue, number of donors, and also gift average, because it's important to be able to not just set goals on them, but to monitor them throughout the year. So if you see, for instance, that you're growing the donor base massively, but the gift average is coming down by 60%, and don't laugh, we've seen this happen, where you've got a lot of $10 donors, $12 donors. We caution against that. So measured growth. The reason I caution against it is because the maintenance to carry those donors, it can become really, really expensive. So part of the plan is getting those donors to give more per capita as fast as we can, as responsibly as we can. So that idea of saying, it's not just about growing donors. It's not just about raising money. We need to make sure that we take a balanced approach, and this is one way to do that. So one more thing on goal setting then. Really, how do we get there? How do we do the goal setting? This was more on the dollars and not the number of donors or gift average. But when you look at how much money do you need to raise and how do you calculate that annual fund? Again, very simple math, very simple formula, but the mistake that most organizations make is they don't take a donor loss into account. They don't take that attrition into account. So this is our simple formula. I hope you're already using something like it, but if you're not, here it is for you. The first one is you take your projected current fiscal year final. That's for every category. Every one of those categories on that previous chart. Take each one of those, figure out where do we really think we're going to land at the end of the fiscal year. Then we minus our historical attrition, and you're going to have to run some reports on that, probably back 3, 4, 5 years, and just say per category, how many donors do we lose and what's their value, to get a percentage and get a dollar amount so that we can utilize that per category. Then we put in quantifiable gross growth, and the way that we get gross growth is really twofold. The first way to do it is historical. So in the same way that we looked at attrition, how much new money do we usually raise per category in a given year? So if you can look at that and say, okay, historically it's about this much money or this much percentage, you have a pretty good idea of what that gross growth is going to be. When I think about quantifiable gross growth, gross dollar growth, it's twofold. It's coming from your current donors who are increasing their gifts, and it's also coming from new donors who have not made a gift or have not made a gift in a long time. And when you do that together, you take your projected current fiscal year final, you less out the historical attrition, you put in the quantifiable gross growth, and that gives you a target for your new fiscal year goal. It may not be the final place that you land, but it's a great place to start, and it's a thoughtful place to start. So if you're not doing this sort of just basic math, basic research, basic math to start to set at least the very least baseline goals, take this and start to work with it. So that is building your annual fund with specific revenue goals in mind for each division. And so as we move on then to number 3, our third best practice, our third fundamental on this, is to front load solicitation activity. So now we're starting our annual fund. We want to front load solicitation activity to achieve 65% of the annual fund goal in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. So again, first 6 months of the fiscal year, you want to be able to have all the asking done of your best prospects, and we're going to go through that in a second. You want to aim for 65 to 70% of your annual fund accomplished, accounted for, if not paid in, at least pledged within the first 6 months of your fiscal year. How do we do that? Well, we go to our best prospects first. And so if you look at this innermost circle slide, and we talk about who to pay attention to, you can see the concentric circles and the board, the current and past board are in the center. And what this represents is that the fewer the number, the higher the value. So we might have very few current and past board members, but because of their current or past commitments to the organization, their value can be really, really high. We want to go to them first and talk to them and secure their giving. We'll talk in a few minutes. I'm just going to touch on the board giving again and how important that is and how you can approach that if in fact you're not front loading your board asking right now. Second thing, the second rung has more people, still high value, but maybe not as high value as your board members, and that would be your renewing and lapsed donors. So this is your current and recent universe of people who have contributed to your annual fund. Again, the number's a little higher. The value might be a little lower, might be a little higher, just depends on what your board activity looks like. Then you move out to the next rung, and it says frequent consumer non-donors. So these are the people who in some way participate in what you do. Maybe they buy tickets, they come to the museum, they go to the zoo, whatever that looks like, whatever your organization is. But in some way, they are consumers of your organization's offerings. But they're not donors. So there's going to be a lot more of them if we're doing good on earned revenue, but they're not contributing. So that's our next group to go to. Then we look at our occasional consumer non-donors. So these would be your one-time attendees. These would be your maybe twice in 18 months, maybe 24 months. So that you see them, but you don't see them that often. And then we have the very large universe of people who are close to your organization, but they're not viewed as direct consumers. That can be just your public at large. So if you're doing free concerts in the park, if you're doing online performances at all, so the kinds of things that draw massive audiences, comparatively massive audiences, but you may or may not always get a chance to bring them into your main facility wherever you do your work. So again, that when you look at the current and past board members in this, the renewing and lapsed donors, and then the frequent consumer and non-donors, those three categories, those would be the ones that I would recommend you focus on in the first 6 months of your fiscal year so that you can hit that 65 to 70% goal that you need to. So then you've got the rest of the fiscal year to get that last 30, 35% that you really, really need. That'll come from these larger pools of prospects, but who will give less per capita and might need more cultivation. So you start to get the feel a little bit there for what the dynamics are and why we talk about building momentum so early in a fiscal year. So part of that, though, we talk about the momentum, and people say, well, how do we get momentum? And first of all, you have that plan and that timeline tied to those goals that we talked about earlier. But I also want to show you this momentum cycle. It's very simple. It's very, very simple. But you need the discipline, not just you, your organization needs the discipline to take care of it. And so you take an action, you get a result, you measure the result, you would make some adjustments if you need to, then you take another action. That's how we build momentum in an annual fund. What we don't do is take an action, get a result, put the annual fund on the shelf for a few weeks because we've got other things to do. Then we kind of come back and look at some reports and then maybe try to remember how we did it and then take an action again. That's a really inefficient, clumsy way to do it. This is a momentum builder. Do this over and over and over again as quickly as you can with those segments that I just talked about. Think about taking an action, getting a result, measuring that result, making adjustments from what you learned, and then taking another action again immediately. That's how you're going to build the real momentum into the annual fund that you need. So before we move on, I'll just say again, front-loading your solicitation activity to achieve 65, maybe 70% of your goal in the first 6 months, using that simple momentum cycle and focusing on the right prospects at the right time. Okay, let's move on then to the next one. This idea of how do we go from prospect to donor? What's the donor cycle? Most people have heard of the donor cycle before, what that looks like. But when it comes to how do you really, really create the momentum that's necessary, we just talked about the momentum cycle, but there's also another flywheel that goes with this, and what we call it is it's our relationship development flywheel. You've seen something like this before, very likely. They have lots of different names. This is what we call it, but they all have pretty much similar, where we need to, characteristics where we need to identify and cultivate and then solicit and then steward or appreciate and then think about what we're going to do with that particular donor next. So how do we create the momentum? First of all, we look at making sure we have enough prospects. You look at that concentric circle that we talked about a few minutes ago, you know right away starting that you do. You have your board, you have your unrenewed and lapsed donors, and then you have your other consumers who are not donors. That is a fixed pool of prospects and donors that you already have in place. So you don't really have to start a lot with identification, but you have to start soon with identification. You need to identify new donors. And then cultivating them. Board members, I'm going to say this, board members deserve a cultivation plan, just like any other donor, because they are just like any other donor. Just because they're a board member doesn't mean they're not a person. And so we want to we want them to give by example, so we want to lead by example in how we approach them. And that starts with everybody having a plan. We need to know who we're going to ask and who's going to ask them and what the amount is, and do they need cultivating in any way? Are they prepared for that, for what we're going to ask them for? Do we need to spend a little time with them? All right, but moving on, then we do the same thing with major gifts, and in some ways we do the same thing with broad-based donors. But looking at that, then the next few steps, it's going to be mostly focused on solicitation. What I'll say about the flywheel is that quite often people only focus on solicitation, which is, it's great, but it's also the thing that if you're doing it well, takes the least amount of time. So this idea of saying, well, we need to identify donors always. We certainly need to cultivate them. We certainly need to appreciate them and steward them and keep them. And we need to think then later about what's their next step in their donor journey with our organization. But so often those things aren't talked about. We only talk about asking. And while it's important, it takes the least amount of time in this entire donor flywheel. As we get into the preparation, we need to look at the timeline first. So every action plan, as you're developing that plan, every action plan must have very specific action steps that are tied to a timeline that really then fall into these areas. Know your target segments. So who's in the target segment that you're going to be asking? Is it renewing donors at $1,500 plus? Is it brand new donors at $500 to $999? What does that look like? And then we need to determine ultimately what the solicitation approach is. Hit that first. Decide that first. What's our solicitation timeline and approach look like? Then we're going to talk about the other two, what's on the other two sides of solicitation. We're going to look at cultivation and we're going to look at stewardship. So if that group needs or that person needs a particular level of cultivation, even though it's listed here underneath solicitation, it's part of the conversation of cultivation may need to happen prior to that actual solicitation point. And then after we get the gift, we will get the gift. After we get the gift, what kind of stewardship do we need? And then, again, the information for who's going to solicit that person. So that's part of your preparation. Either what person or what mechanism is going to solicit that person or that group. What kind of notes do we need on that person or group? And so that's how we begin to develop our preparation for them. So that's our timeline. So we when we combine those together and we look at how we create both the momentum using them. So we utilize the momentum cycle. We utilize the from prospect to donor flywheel. And now we're looking at each segment and preparing for that. Let's just look at a couple of these segments so that you know, you have an example and sort of know what I'm talking about. Let's look first at the board giving mindset, because after all, this is the group we want to start with. This is the very first group that we talked to in the fiscal year. It's the group that we want the earliest commitment from that we can possibly get. So the board giving mindset is, first of all, we need board members to give first, give strong, and to set the pace for the annual fund. So what set the pace really means is be generous. This idea of giving first, giving strong, and being generous. That's what we want from the board so that we can tell that story over and over and over again throughout the year to our other donors and to our prospective donors. We want 100% participation. My question, bluntly, to a board member who is not giving, if you are on the board and you are not making an annual contribution, why are you on the board? And I know that there's going to be exceptions to that, but again, we're talking about the rules. We need 100% board participation. We can approach other donors from a position of strength. that we can show that our board's doing everything they can do for this organization to which they volunteer, and that they're being as generous as they can, and they're encouraging other people to be as generous as they can as well. So one of the things, and with that 100% participation, getting as a good amount, whatever a good amount is for your organization, of increased support from the board. The value of the increased support is really twofold. One is so that you can say the board has given, and they've given more than they gave in the previous year. They've committed more than they did last year. Secondly, quite often what we'll recommend is whatever that total amount is that the board increased their giving in total. So let's say they jump 4% and that's $25,000, whatever that equals. That amount can often be used for challenge grants for other divisions. So you might take the board, new $25,000 total, and apply that to the broad base as a challenge grant set forth by the board. So we think about that, using that money to secure a challenge grant. Of course, we target increases. Maybe not every board member can give an increase every year. And let's hope that your organization's not in a position to have to ask that year over year, but really thoughtful, targeted increases. Those targeted increases could be by dollar amount. They could be multi-year gifts that graduate up each year. So several different ways. So when I think about targeting increases, it's not just one-dimensional. It's about how you can approach that board member, that donor, to do something very special, either in terms of money or time or both. Then last on this, how you do it. How do we solicit them? Well, we don't solicit them at a board meeting and put envelopes with their pledge form in them at their table and ask everybody to grab one and fill it out. Again, board members are people. We want to treat them like people. We want to ask them individually. We want to demonstrate. We want to set the model starting with our board. So individual visits with board members from the board chair, maybe from the executive director, the managing director, whoever that is, but personal asks. This is where we begin our practice of personal asks. And then we follow up with letters and phone calls as we need to. It'll set the entire tone moving forward into your annual fund for the rest of the year. Okay, so then let's look at major gifts. So that's a little bit about the board. So if we say that last best practice was the board should demonstrate pace-setting giving, which we believe, then we also believe then that our sixth fundamental is that major gift solicitations must be relationship-based, and those asks must be in person as often as possible, not mechanized. They must be in person and personalized as much as you possibly can. So when we look at the major gift mindset, it's going to look a little bit in some places like the board. Again, these are our best donors. And these are the people who give the largest amount, who probably hopefully consume at very high levels from our offerings. And so we definitely want to be able to spend time with them, and again, early in the fiscal year. Now, I know what some people will say. They're going to say, well, I've got some major donors who give in the last quarter of the fiscal year, and I don't want to make them mad. I don't want you to make them mad either. What I want you to do, though, is think about, if you can't back them up all the way to the front end of the fiscal year, think about backing them up by 1 quarter, maybe 2 quarters, but probably 1 quarter from where they currently give. So if they usually give in May, let's try to give maybe in January or February. If they usually give in January, maybe we can back them up to November or October. Start to think about that. What we're ultimately aiming for is renewing all of them in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. So that's our major gift mindset. Number 1, renew them in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. Again, now, some of these folks may say, I only pay this time of the year. My response, that's fine. All we're really asking you to do is make your pledge right now at that increased gift level. So the reason we ask you to do it early is because we've got a pretty significant growth target, and we need time to go out and speak with potential new donors. So knowing that you're in this year would be a great relief to us, and we can start to focus on getting people like you who also want to give to the annual fund. That's the mindset. So the second point on this is, again, we start with current donors, then we go to lapsed donors, then we go to new acquisitions. And if you can look at those current donors and those lapsed donors and again, really aim at getting them done in the first 6 months of the fiscal year, that's going to be a big plus for you. All right, then targeting increases is number 3. That's a holdover from the last slide. It doesn't mean that you're going to ask every single major donor to make an increase. What it does mean is you're going to look at every single donor as part of your solicitation planning and decide thoughtfully whether or not they might make an increase, and if so, why, and if not, why, and if so, what's the amount. So that's part of that targeting increases. Doesn't mean you have to do it every time, but you need to go through the process every time. Number 4 is leveraging an existing challenge grant, maybe the one that came from the board, maybe securing a new challenge grant. Sometimes a handful of major donors will come together and make a combined increased gift that's large enough that then you can use that at the broad base of support as a challenge grant to them. And you get to use a name that's quite often recognizable in your community. Everybody wins. It's nice leverage. It's certainly legitimate, and it really helps everybody do their very, very best for your annual fund. Then number 5 is we recruit 2 to 3 board members to make calls, visits, and asks. So again, we don't start with letters. These are personal asks. We have relationships in most cases with these donors, that we see them frequently. There's no reason not to go ask them personally, unless they just tell you, don't come talk to me, which I so rarely hear. Again, that's an exception to the rule. It's certainly not the rule. So think about recruiting 2 to 3 board members who are going to help make calls, make visits, and ask for support. Number 6 on this is recruit the board to manage stewardship activities. So when I think about the solicitation team, so sort of back to the previous point, I think about that solicitation team. It is 5, maybe 6 people who are dedicated to the act of asking, the act of fundraising itself. And they're going to make calls, they're going to make visits, they're going to go see people, they're going to do what they need to do. But then we've got the rest of the board who we're not going to try to engage as askers, but we are going to try to engage them. We need to engage them as people who can both sweep in potential new donors, help us identify those people, and then on the other side of that solicitation in the flywheel, help us keep donors through stewardship and appreciation. So this is a place, a line of delineation. I want all board members focused on the practice of fundraising, but in the process of fundraising, but I want just a handful of board members and some of the staff involved in the act of fundraising. And that's how we build a really efficient annual fund at these top levels. So it gives you a little bit of a flavor as we top off this idea that major gift solicitations must be relationship based, and the asks must be in person and not mechanized. All right, so back to the flywheel, just to take a look at this again, because I said cultivation and stewardship are as important as the ask. I've really hammered that during this video. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that you've got to develop all these brand new things, all these new activities that are going to cost time and money and resources. What I would say is you, whatever size your institution is, you think about cultivation and stewardship. Think about activities that you already do. Think about things you're already involved in. Those might be artist-focused. Those might be community-focused. They might be with teachers. They might be with partners. So think about things you're already doing. Choose 3, maybe 4 kinds of activities to overlay that. So it might be something post-concert or post-event. Might be pre-concert, pre-event. It might be something when you bring school kids in for an art class. It might be if you're a performing arts center to do specific backstage tour, something. But think about what you're already doing, and don't try to make cultivation and stewardship events out of whole cloth, because it'll just cost you money and time that you very likely don't have. And there's no reason to start over when you have quality activities that you're already doing. And then as we go into really our case for support, so message is always important. The question I get often is, what should our case statement be? The most boiled saying that I can come down to is that your case for support must be value-based. Don't be needs-based. And that's the big difference. So I see so many organizations talk about what they need, what they need, what they need, what they need. They'll use things like 20% of your ticket or 30% of your ticket covers the cost of our concerts, or covers the cost of everything that we do. And I find that to be a particularly weak message. And the reason I find it weak is if you're going to go to your consumers and basically tell them, listen, we're glad you came to our offering, but the amount you paid to attend wasn't enough. So we want you to subsidize your own admission fee with an annual fund gift. Doesn't that sound great? Well, it's not great. It's not a great pitch. It doesn't have leverage. And for people who take it in a way that you may not intend it, which is the most important thing, how are they interpreting it? It really does look like you're asking them to subsidize what they've already paid for. What's a better one? It's value-based. So you think about turning the mirror outward of your organization. So instead of having a mirror and looking at yourself, talking about how pretty you are, and all the things that you just do, the things you do, the things you do, the things you do, you turn that mirror outward. You talk more about why. Why do you do them? You think about how you reflect within your community or your communities, if it's multiple communities. Think about how your organization reacts. How does it look? What's its value? What do you do that nobody else can do the same way? What is your irreplaceable value in the community? That's how we build a case statement. So when you look at this, really how to begin to develop, and if you're really focused on being value-based, then I would say most case statements that are well balanced have these three things in them. They're a combination of facts, feelings, and finances. So if you look at facts, feelings, and finances and you figure out what that balance is, have information within your case statement about all three of those, because some people you talk to are going to be numbers people. Some people are going to just want to know what you're doing and where and why and so forth. And other people then are going to want to know what it feels like. What do the people who consume this feel like? What do the school kids think? What do, if you're going into senior homes, what do they think? If you're going into new communities, what do they think? So the feeling that your activities evoke, that's the balance we would say look for. The other parts, and you can see them drop down here on this slide, first of all, the case has to be very easily understood. You are not writing a novel. A case statement needs to be a page and a half that you can draw information from. It has to be easily understood, easily digestible by anyone you talk to, no matter how close or distant they are from your organization. So think about how you can do that. Value-based message. Think about impact. Think about uniqueness, and make it very easily understood. Then again, the second one is guide for externally focused donor communications. Make sure that you are messaging this out, not just through development, but through your entire organization. We need external focus on donor communications. Outreach, think outreach. How are we often informing about good news, the why behind what we do, how it impacts the community, how it impacts the donor, and putting that sort of brief message, but repetitive message out there multiple times. And again, I'll come back to this last one, thinking more about why instead of what. What is important, but if you focus too much on what, then it just becomes a competition of, are we doing more than this other arts organization or this other not-for-profit? Can we check more boxes? Is it just about volume? And I can tell you, it's not about volume. It's not about volume. It's about quality. The quality of the work that you do, the value of the work that you do is what donors will really pay attention to. They don't need a punch list of 200 activities to say, well, that seems like a pretty good value for my $250 gift. This is more about what the depth of how you do your work looks like. Okay, so that last one then, again, that is your case for support must be value-based. So we've got these 8. Again, they are certainly not all of them. This is just a handful, a small smattering of the fundamentals necessary to really effectively grow your annual fund. You know, maybe in some upcoming episodes, we're likely to go through the journey of how do you make an ask and who makes an ask and all that. Most effective kind of stewardship activities. We'll get more in depth with those things, but I wanted to give you these 8 fundamentals first. Have you compare that maybe with the activity and work that you're doing, how you sequence things in your arts organization. Just challenge how you look at it. Make those comparisons. Think about some of the advantages to the 8 that I've put here, and of course, and if you found today's video helpful, I'm going to ask you, please, of course, like, subscribe, and share, like everybody does on YouTube. And if you're really interested in learning more about our services at RSC, or you're interested in maybe engaging us, please just reach out to us at rscfundraising.com. Thank you.